Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Ludic Lekgotla at the Zones of Connection Symposium. Thanks to Avi and Nick for organizing this amazing conference. I'm Kieran Reid. I'm head of department of WITS Digital Arts in South Africa, and I'm here with two of my colleagues to talk about teaching game design, in particular teaching analog and tabletop games in game design. So let me introduce my colleagues. Kirsten, do you want to just give yourself a brief introduction?
Hi, I am Kirsten. I'm a lecturer at WITS in the Digital Arts Department, where I lecture analog game design in first year, writing and interactivity in third year, and I'm also running a fourth year research project on meaningful gamification. Romeo, over to you.
Yes, I'm Romeo Molongoana. I also teach analog game design in a first year setting at the WITS Digital Arts. I am currently doing my master's in the experiential or evocative nature of video games.
Thanks, Romeo. Thanks, Kirsten. So to just kick off, we've entitled this Ludic Lekgotla, which I'm sure for those of you who aren't South African or aren't in nearby regions in Africa, it's probably a very strange name. So we thought we'd start with an introduction about what a Lekgotla is, and sort of how, in some ways, it tries to kind of personify or exemplify the way that we view teaching, and the way that we want our department to run. So I'm going to hand over for this section to Romeo. Then we'll introduce our courses and stuff, and then just break into a general conversation. Any questions you have, please pop them in the chat, and then we'll get to them after we've done a little bit of a chat. So over to you, Romeo.
All right. Now I know, as Kieran has said, that it might sound like a little bit of a weird word, but it derives or comes from a Tswana Sotho word meaning a meeting or a place of gathering, where the sort of ideas and concepts of a community are brought together in order to find an amicable sort of path forward or way forward. It's in case you are sort of Tswana speaking or Sotho speaking, I've heard of words similar, not to be confused with lekgotla, which is to poke or to dig around in, or hutla, which is to come back. Those are very sort of phonetic languages, and lekgotla is the right spelling there. Almost, yeah. So the two might be conflated a little bit, but it has, I suppose, the same the sort of the same feelings as a DMC. A nice, deep, meaningful conversation, or just a little blom session. Just chilling, relaxing, maybe a glass of wine. We're blooming, we're chilling. And this one I hate, which Kieran also sort of brought up, is the idea of chin wagging. Something I didn't know was a thing or even a word that existed, but I don't like it because it sounds like a wet tentacle. Like that's the image that I get. It's just chin wagging. It doesn't sound right. But sort of it's all in the same realm. It's all in the same sort of capacity and has the same emotional feel. It is very much a place where ideas, thoughts, and feelings are shared and heard, more specifically, and acknowledged as well towards a certain outcome or to help in a progression of an idea. And sort of that starts to have the same, or starts to fall a little bit into our teaching philosophy and how we approach our classes. And I'm sure my colleagues will be able to add a little bit on this later on. But it definitely feeds into our ideas that everyone has something to say. Everyone has something meaningful to add, and everyone has an idea. And to acknowledge someone's idea or to hear what they have to say is just as important as the idea itself. Not only does it help another person know that, what, I am contributing here, but also that the thing that comes out at the end, I had an input there. I had something to do with it. And there's an active investment and an active buy-in when you have a community, when you have everyone coming together to generate a new kind of knowledge, to generate a new way of moving forward. I just want to touch a little bit on that idea of the generation of knowledge or the generating of knowledge. We in a South African context, come very much from a colonialized history where our knowledge, our sort of understanding of the world and design as we teach is shaped very much by the West. And so we're in a stage now where people are starting to become awakened or more realizing that what they have in terms of new practices, in terms of new design, new ways to design, is different from what has already been established. And when we come together in a Lekgotla, the aim is to hear those ideas as well and use them in a conducive manner in order to create a knowledge or body of knowledge that works for the community itself. This way, we have people who are not just recreating what has already been created, but finding specific outcomes and specific things that work towards them, that work towards, or that are specific to them rather, not simply just only works towards them. I think that is not just the philosophy that we have in our classes, but I think it's sort of like an overarching departmental feeling. Even in our staff meetings, there is there's we have these things called stand-ups where people can talk and say what they want to say and do what they want to do. But there's also this nature of play because when you have people together, when you're all engaging in a task that is for you, by you, there's a give and take. There's a push and pull, and in some instances that sort of starts to emulate a little bit of play. And we have and that sort of energy that we bring into the discussion, we bring into a Lekgotla, is what we are trying to really harness, not just in our teaching, but into the department as a whole. One quick example that I think that just came to mind: we used to have Nerf wars before our building started being renovated, and it's funny because you have someone who's like, "Hey, I bought a Nerf gun." And I think it was Kieran actually was like, "Hey, we bought Nerf guns." And then you have Ray who's like, "Hey, I have a Nerf gun." And then and then I started buying Nerfs and Nerf darts and Nerf guns as well to join. And it's sort of this building together. Everyone adds to a compound whole and a workable whole, and sort of brings this nature of play along with it. And sort of this atmosphere is I think is pretty sound, not just in our teaching, but in how we run the department and how the department is run. And that attitude and that nature of play is something that we like to bring forth throughout. Yeah.
Thanks, Romeo. I think you summed it up perfectly. And just to touch on that idea of kind of generating knowledge, I think that's also why I know it's why we entitled it Ludic Lekgotla, because we are dealing with a lot of content that is very Western in its nature. So games have, obviously there's kind of an Eastern influence, and there are Eastern games that we could be looking at, but the majority is coming from a Western background, and we're reinterpreting it, and we're trying to say, okay, cool, Ludic, that's Latin, we understand, that's where some of it comes from, but we're going to talk about it in our own language, and we're going to make decisions about it in our own language. So that's why we've entitled it Ludic Lekgotla. And partly for that playfulness that Romeo was talking about. And that shift is really important for us, in that, one moment is a chin wag with Romeo's scary wagging tentacle, but the next minute we're talking about serious things like decolonization and how to kind of change the education. We want playfulness to be both fun and woo, I'm having fun, but also I'm playfully interrogating these serious ideas, and I'm approaching them in various different ways. So we thought next what we should do before we get into kind of just general conversation is explain our degree a little bit. So this is sort of the information dump section of the talk. So we do a full 4-year digital arts degree, which has a focus in some degrees on game design. Though that was the original kind of trajectory. Now we've opened up to have 4 different streams. We look at animation, we look at game design, we look at interactive media, and experimental narrative and interactive writing. So we have 4 streams, and we have quite a diverse program in that students can elect to choose which direction they go through once they finish their first couple of years. We were also the first full degree in game design that was offered in Africa, which put a lot of pressure on us, was also really exciting for us. It means that also Romeo, who was one of our first students, I think he was in the third year we were ever running the program, is one of the first people in Africa to have a degree in game design. There you go, Romeo. So, you know, there's a lot of excitement there. And fortunately, we've seen the industry grow. We're working with other institutions to try and create a stronger industry in all digital spheres in Africa, and a lot of that through game design and working through that. One of the things about our degree, which we are very proud of, is that we're working across 2 different schools within the University of the Witwatersrand. And that is, we're working with engineering and we're working with the School of Arts. So half of our students, or maybe a little less than half, are electrical engineering students, and the other half are School of the Arts students. So what this means for us pedagogically is that we're able to kind of approach all these digital spaces from varying different fields, from various different understandings. So some of it's very much about what is representation in games? How does representation work? And then on the other hand, it's also, how does the system of a game work? What is the systems thinking? What is the design practice behind a game and all of those kinds of things? So we're very proud of that, and we think it's working quite well to have a really kind of diverse students. What's really interesting, though, is sometimes the best coders end up being the art students, and some of the engineering students come over and are amazing writers. And it's, I think, because of their exposure to so many different kinds of thinking and ways of being around those kinds of things. Like I mentioned, a lot of our art comes around playfulness and the idea of kind of playfully experimenting with complex ideas and all of those kinds of things. One of the major, I don't want to call it an issue, but one of the major conversations that we're always having, and it's something that we interrogate in all of our curriculums, is this idea of, are we creating graduates who can go out and get employed in the industry, or are we creating university graduates who are more geared towards an analysis or a kind of critical thinking around how they work? And it's a tough thing to balance, because on the one hand, it's a lot of analysis, it's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of engaging. On the other hand, it's a lot of kind of skills development. So the way we've structured it is that the first year you learn about design and you learn about thinking and some of the criticality there. In second year, and I'm talking particular in the game program, is you talk about, you learn how to code and work through that. And then in the third year, you sort of combine those two into something different. So that's the way that we're trying to work and think through that. In terms of our demographics, which is a really important thing, when we started the program in a country that's predominantly Black, we had 4 Black students and 3 female students in a class of 30. So our demographics are really bad. And we pushed and tried a lot to kind of reshape that, because we really want to provide opportunities for women in the tech industry, which is a very difficult space around the world, and in South Africa is no different. And then also for young Black and colored students who have very little exposure to the tech space and how to work through that and think through that. So yeah, we're really pushing that kind of thing. And that's part of what Romeo was talking about, that kind of, we're generating new knowledges. What is an African game? How do we think about games in African context? It's a very difficult process. I'm not going to say we're even nearly there. It's something every year we go, okay, this is what we've succeeded in, and there's a lot more to kind of progress on. There's a lot more to kind of think on. I think what we have done successfully is created an environment which, as I said, might at first seem quite scary to women or to our Black students, because it's tech and it's those kinds of things. But last year at our exhibition, one of our graduating students, Kamogelo, gave this really beautiful talk about how she was quite terrified, and she felt so welcome as a young Black woman in this space. And now she's like, I'm going to make games that have Black women. I'm going to make animations that have Black women. I'm going to show everyone that it's possible. So I think that that's one of our great successes. I think our curriculum still needs a lot of work. It's something we're always interrogating, but I think we're moving in the right direction. And it's something that we're all very proud of as staff in Wits Digital Arts. So yeah, that's the program in its full entirety. But we're here specifically to talk about our first year course, which is in particular, as I mentioned right in the beginning, a tabletop analog course. So that's where the students' kind of first entry into game design and thinking about it is. For that course, the current lecturer for this semester is Romeo and Kirsten, but Kirsten's going to kind of give us the details of that course. How it functions, how things, and then we're going to talk through some of the challenges and some of the exciting opportunities that come from the teaching of that course. So Kirsten, do you want to take us away?
Thank you, Kieran, and hello to Leah the cat, joining us on Kieran's lap. I am curious, is Cthulhu the ultimate chinwagger, Romeo, in your estimation? You can think about it and let me know. So yeah, as Kieran said, Romeo and I together ran Game Design 1 for the first semester. So right now we are in the thick of it. We are a few weeks away from the exam period starting, and then exams, and then a little bit of a break, thank goodness for everyone involved, and then on to semester 2. The Game Design 1 course is primarily focused on board games, and analog games in general. We don't touch anything digital for the entirety of the first year. Well, I mean, some students will use digital games to give examples and think through some concepts and ideas, and we, of course, welcome that. But the students don't make anything digital. They start that in second year, and there's a few reasons why we do that. The first reason is that we believe that it is a lot harder to learn design principles when you also have to code the thing that you're designing. It's a lot easier to design when all you need is pen and paper, some cardboard, maybe some dice. So we stuck to the first year around teaching design principles, concepts like what is a mechanic? What are systems? What is a game? How can we think about those different things, those different ideas, and implement them into the games that we're building? And then when we hand them over to Tim, who takes second year, then he's got students who understand design principles and then can apply those principles into the work that they're then learning to code. The other reason why we start with board games is because they are more accessible. We can do print and plays of games quite easily. South Africa and Africa in general has quite a rich history of traditional games. Romeo's favorite, Murabaraba, which in other parts of the world known as Nine Man Morris, but slightly different, are games that we can draw on that the students are familiar with because they played them in the playground when they were at school. So there's an analog game tradition in South Africa that we can draw on and use as case studies, as kind of models of games, as versions of games that we can modify or upgrade or make changes to. And so there's just a general sense of accessibility that exists with analog games that doesn't exist in the same way with digital games. Our department has worked quite hard to make both kinds of games accessible for our students in general. So when we're not in lockdown, which we have been for over a year and haven't been onto campus for over a year, we have an excellent, really well-equipped playroom that has loads of board games, and we've got consoles and TVs and computers that the students can come and access and play a wide variety of games and kind of build on their game knowledge. And while they're doing that, outside of the class, inside of the class, we're very much focused on board and card games and a little bit of role-playing games as well. But that's in one of their other subjects. So give me a second just to double check my thing because my second screen isn't working. Generally in our course, what we're looking to do by the end of the course is have students who are able to engage with kind of core basic principles of game design, ideas around iterating, playtesting, prototyping, thinking about systems, using playtest data, thinking about art and graphics and user interface, and really a myriad of I've totally gone blank of the word, a myriad of concepts that one can apply in the kind of game design. So those are kind of broad outcomes. Quite specifically, during COVID, we have moved into outcomes that require more reflection and setting and achieving of objectives. So before COVID, we ran our program in quite a lab-based way. So our labs, which are our longest session each week, 3 hours, all 100 of our students in one room with tiled floors and lots of noise, sitting around tables, building games, cutting out sheets of paper, throwing things around, testing their Twitch skill games, causing chaos, having loads of fun. And then our wonderful, wonderful tutors who come from our really excellent master's bursary program would be there kind of in the thick of it with the students, playtesting their games, giving them feedback, helping them figure out what's the next step. In COVID, that's not possible, unfortunately. And we have a lot of students who are quite restricted in a number of ways. Their home environment often isn't conducive to studies, and that can include not having their own workspace, not having access to internet, not having access to resources used to kind of physically build and make games, not having access to playtesters within the kind of COVID-safe environment. So there's a lot of challenges that our students have come up against during COVID, and we've had to dramatically adjust our curriculum because of that. And so what we've done is we've really emphasized the reflection process. So at this point, we're less concerned about whether or not the games that they make are good or fun or aren't broken. We're much more concerned about whether or not they're able to tell us why their game is the way that it is, the effect that it has on the player, the impact that one mechanic will have on the whole experience. Really pushing that reflection in a time when we are able to put less emphasis on the actual design process. So that's first year. I think that's it, unless Kieran or Romeo have anything they want to add to what first year looks like.
No, I think that's a pretty good summary. And as we get into some of the kind of details about the challenges and opportunities, I think we'll touch on more of the course in various different ways. The one thing I do want to kind of mention, Kirsten, you're talking about accessibility, is we've managed to, and this took us quite a while, to get a laptop scheme going where we're able to distribute laptops to our students. Unfortunately, that only kicks in second year. So under these COVID circumstances, there are a lot of our first year students who just don't even have a machine, don't have it. You know, we get essays typed on the phone and work through in those kinds of ways. And, you know, it's been quite a challenge around those things. And actually, that's one of the main things that we wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about the kind of socioeconomic context that we teach in and how that plays out. And the one big obvious thing is data and access and all of those kinds of things. But we also did want to talk about exposure and exposure to games in various different capacities. What was interesting about the panel, we were on a panel yesterday with some educators from the United Kingdom who are also talking about the fact that their students come in and they haven't heard, a board game, and they haven't had any kind of exposure to, they know Scrabble, they know 30 Seconds, which is a South African guessing game, and so they know those kinds of things, but they don't know more than that in terms of games. I think for us, the thing that's really challenging is that a lot of our students don't even know digital games. In that they might have played 1 or 2 games in their life. They might have played, if they're lucky enough to have a smartphone, something like Candy Crush, but that's sort of the extent of where they're playing. Obviously, every student's going to be different and there's going to be different levels of exposure, but that is certainly something that we're thinking about all the time. And how do we rectify that? And how do we kind of teach basic ludic or literacies around play and around those various type of things? Yesterday, Romeo, you had a wonderful anecdote about your experience going into the degree when you were in first year and the games that you had played. And it's one of those classic Catan got me into board games, but I wondered if maybe you want to touch on that and the kinds of exposure that you had entering the program, and if the similarities you see with your current students and all of those kinds of things. So I thought that'll be a good starting point, but we can make this less formal now. We've done the information. So if either of you two want to just jump in there, or otherwise we're not showing that playfulness that we do have. So, but Romeo, go ahead. There you go. Thank you. Done. Sorted.
Yeah, I did mention yesterday that the one board game that really got me to understand the beauty of board games was Settlers of Catan, and that's because we used to have mini tournaments in our labs in my first year, where would get the game from the library, would sit down, would play for like the hour break that we've got. But we'd normally go obviously into a little bit of class time. So we have Kieran come in and be like, yeah, well, this color won, orange won today. And we're like, but my work, all my work. And before that, I never really had an exposure to games. I was very fortunate, if I can put it that way, that my sister, who is 7 years older than me, sort of introduced me to games like skipping, got me introduced to games like I can't remember now, but we used to use pantyhose, torn up pantyhose, and we'd put them around our waist, and then we'd have to jump over. You making different patterns out of the pantyhose, and that was my first real exposure to games like to actual proper analog games and playground games. And in fact, my first exposure to games in general. But that's as far as my sphere was. That's as far as I knew. That's as much as I knew. A game was hopscotch. A game was skipping. And then it further extended to a game is something as simple as snakes and ladders. You pick up a dice, you roll it, you use your stones to go across a track of 1 to 100. And my realm was fairly small. And it was with my interaction with Settlers of Catan and then later Dominion, where I realized that I can be challenged in a different way by the games that I play. I can be challenged, or another skill that I believe I've got can be challenged in a certain way. And sort of, a lot of us used to play Monopoly also while growing up. But even games like that, I only got to play because I had friends who had those. I had friends who had games like Bubble, which was one of my first digital games that I played. And so my exposure to a lot of the games was simply because of the people that I knew, not necessarily because it was readily available to me. And that's something that I see emulated, or even something that we normally take for granted with the teaching that happens now. I had a student in one of my tutorials who said, I've never played Monopoly. I've heard of it, but I've never actually played it. And it sets you back to realize that, the availability of games, it's not as easy as people think, especially in a COVID setting, especially in a pandemic setting. Their exposure to those kind of games, even roll and rise to a certain extent, to download the thing, firstly to, as you said, to find data and then to go online to download the things, print them out, or or to draw it yourself. There is a certain barrier there that we're definitely challenged with, because you'll find that in my first year, I had a few of my peers who would know about what you call about offset collection games, or would know about worker placement games. And my knowledge very much, came from their experience. It came from what they knew. It came from what they've played. I mean, you mentioned yesterday that I knew about Street Fighter, and so I made a game about Street Fighter. And that's about as far as my experience of the kind of games that I was exposed to went. Which sort of also talks to, I guess, the whole idea of Lekgotla. You use what you've got, you bring it in, and you try and make something new from that. But I still felt, to an extent, that I didn't know as much, or it was no longer a thing of I know something different. It was because I haven't played games, I haven't been exposed to games, I don't know much. And that's very much, I think, the that I see now as well with a lot of my students, is that they feel that because they don't play games, they don't know anything, or they don't know much, or don't have anything of value to contribute, which is something that we keep trying to move them away from, and try to show that what you think you don't know is actually what we're looking for. The things that you think aren't going to help is what you should be bringing to the sphere. But that is a difficulty in that sphere for sure.
Yeah, in fact, Romeo, I mean, that makes me think of three different things. And then Kirsten, I'm just going to ask you a question following on from this. The one thing, that judging is something that we've had to deal. Excuse me. There's a bird called a hardy-dar in South Africa. They're making a lot of noise. If it disturbs you, they're the worst birds ever. So that thing of judging, we've actually had quite a number of issues of students who come from a more privileged background. They've played this game, they've played that game, and then they're like, "What? You don't know that game? You haven't played that game? You must be such an idiot. Why are you designing games?" And it's something that we fight each year. But one of the things about that is really interesting for me is that a lot of the students who have that exposure and that privilege come in knowing the codified language of games. But actually, in some ways, that's a huge limitation to their creativity, because they feel like, oh, well, I have to make a game like this. I have to make a game like that. I have to, and actually, they kind of lack the exposure to, or the kind of freedom to play with the ideas and to create new play experiences. So that's something that we try to kind of integrate across our two different kind of student groups in that sense, those who are familiar with the language and those who aren't, and try to get it like, you know this language, that's fine, but you're stuck in it. This person doesn't, and they're going to learn that language, and they're also going to give you new ideas you've never thought about. And it's something that we're always constantly trying to bridge that and kind of link them together. I mean, it used to be that Skyrim was one of our key examples in first year, for all its problems. So sometimes it was an example for good, and sometimes it was an example for bad. And in fact, a student came up to us when she was in third or fourth year and said, "Hey, everyone's talking about Skyrim. I've never played it." And, this was in the first few years of our degree. And it was a moment that we should have been aware of, but we weren't, that actually we can't just go in and teach as if everyone knows the same codified language, which is obviously the case for a lot of disciplines, but we had some core assumptions about that, and changing that has radically helped us. And also it helps our students, because if, let's say, Romeo is a student and he gives the example, he says, "Oh, in Skyrim this happened, or in God of War this happened." We'll then go, "Okay, well, Romeo, before you go on, tell the rest of your class what that game is." And that forcing them to actually describe it and think about it, that process of explaining has become really, really useful. The other thing, and actually this is not something we have written down or thought about, but the experience of a lot of students from poorer backgrounds is that one person in your neighborhood has a PlayStation, and you all go to your friend's house and you play the PlayStation. As Romeo was saying, one person has Monopoly, so you all go and play there. And this is the question for us to think about going forward. I wonder if the types of play that we should be expecting and promoting are deliberately multiplayer in their outlook, so that they're deliberately about playing with your friends, because that's the kind of general trend that people have. And I think maybe some of our examples that we're using at the moment might be a little bit solo-esque, which obviously in COVID we need to worry about. But, you know, like a Euro game's often described as solitaire with other players. But maybe we need to focus on designing play experiences that are to be shared with friends. Anyway, that's something. And Tim, if you are listening, make a note of that for second year as well, so that we can go there. Kirsten, I wanted to ask you about what our kind of, so obviously Romeo's talking about that exposure of playing Catan during lunch breaks, which we can't do now. What are the things that we're trying to do during COVID to tackle those kinds of things, and your experience of exposure as well would be useful.
I'll start with the second question first. So I've been interested in analog games since I struggled to socialize as a young child, and so the way in which I spent my breaks or recess, depending on where you're from in the world, I suppose, was by organizing game type events during break time, because the other kids in my grade would want to play, and that meant that I had people to play with. So I was quite an awkward child. So I had a bit of an Uno gambling ring going on. It was a round robin, organizing Foursquare tournaments, things like that. So games have been part of the way in which I interact with people for most of my life. And then during my gap year, where I was working 3 horrible retail jobs, the one thing that kept me sane was a year-long D&D campaign. And that was my real first kind of involvement in like modern hobby board games, and all downhill from there. I met Kieran. He lectured me in the theatre department, introduced me to Dominion as well, and now I have too many and spend far too much money on board games. But the way in which we're trying to help expose our students, particularly during COVID, so our current batch of first years have been in our program for 3 months now, haven't been to campus though, and are unlikely to return to campus in any meaningful way until at least next year. So what we have done is we have adopted quite seriously this semester roll and write as our kind of core genre that we're looking at. And the reason why we've done that is because what some, not all, but what some roll and writes offer is the opportunity for 100 people to play the same game at the same time, which is very important and helpful for us because there are 120 students in our class and a few staff. So each week we send out the rules and the sheet for the students to either print or draw out. They're often quite easy, railroad ink, it's just a grid and some arrows that you need to draw out. And then we have a session where I will teach them the rules of the game. We find it's really useful for the students to actually spend some time working through the rule book and developing literacy in that way. And then we play together. So depending on who has the game, if it's a Kieran will roll the dice, take the pictures, and Leah's little paws will be in the pictures, which is often really enjoyed by our students. And we'll upload the dice rolls for each round, and the students, we all hop onto a call and we play together and then can use those games, those play sessions as some of our core case studies. We also have games like Maraba Raba, Mancala, Shobu, which is a published game as opposed to a more traditional abstract strategy game, which are games that the students are able to pretty easily reproduce themselves, and then can play at home either by mimicking a second player, and we give them some guidance as to how best to do that, or by asking a family member or whoever to play with them. So we are not able to expose them to games in the way that we had before, where we had students playing Cosmic Encounter and Mansions of Madness and Ruth and all those kinds of really exciting, more big bucks kinds of games, but the principles are the same. Hopefully, when we're able to return to campus, our playroom will be absolutely bursting with students who are able to take off a game like Root from the shelf and work through the rule book, having developed that skill during COVID, and be able to take the components out and play the game.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, that leads me to a question, and it's about rule books, and it's this idea of a current generation which, to be quite frank, has been let down by the schooling system in this country to a large degree. But also, I imagine it's a worldwide phenomenon of, let me go watch Rodney Smith teach me how to play this game. I'm not going to read the rules, right? I'm going to engage in this way. I'm going to wait for my lecturer, Kirsten, and I'm going to wait for my lecturer, Romeo, and they're going to teach me the game. And I'm not going to kind of actively engage with the rule book. And, because the truth is that tabletop games to a large degree require more input on that initial kind of get it up and running than a digital game, right? I can switch on my PlayStation now and play a game. But with the board game, I have to set it up. I have to read the rules. I have to understand the rules. And what are your approaches as two of the lecturers there to deal with that kind of thing, and to get students to read the rules, to get students to enjoy the rules? I'm such a board gamer that I'll read rules even if I have no intention of playing the game, just because I want to understand the system. But that's not obviously going to be every student. And a lot of our students do come in to learn how to make digital games. They want to make the next FIFA, right? They're excited about that. And now we're forcing them to read this rule book, which is long and clunky sometimes, because unfortunately the industry still has too many poorly written rule books. So what are the kind of strategies and attempts that you're making in the classroom to deal with that? And are they successful at all?
I know Kirsten has her tactics, but we mentioned yesterday that what helped me a lot was me working for a board games and toys distribution company in my teen years, I suppose, or earlier part of my years. And I obviously I interacted with a lot of different people in a lot of different settings. I had to make people who weren't there to play a game want to engage with the game, and I can't exactly be like, cool, here's the rules, read that, and so that we can play together, and I can sell you this game, because there's obviously there was a threefold method there: show them the game, get them interested in it, get them interested enough to want to buy it. But obviously, when it comes into a teaching setting, that changes entirely. You're no longer doing it for the sake of trying to sell the game. You're trying for them to learn the system of the game and what makes it tick. But the approach, I think, is very similar. How I used to do it when we were very much together was, I'm going to tell you the interesting parts about this game. I'm going to tell you, hey, let's take King of Tokyo, for instance. Everyone has a monster. You get to fight each other's monsters. The biggest monster wins. It's a summarized version, really cut down. We cut away all the layers of fat that make it hard for them to bite into, and you make it a little bit more approachable in that stance. And then from there, it's, oh, cool, I get to be a master. What kind of masters can I be, is usually the question. And that's when you bring out, it's sort of real, but the words and the booklets and the things are what's most likely gonna make someone turn away, because that more imposing and it has a lot of power. It also assumes a very static sort of way to play. So rather bring in the bits. Hey, here's the King Kong figure. Oh, cool. Here's a Cyber Bunny. Look, I'm Gigazor. And sort of really showing the pieces and allowing them to start to build an idea of the game for themselves, I find makes going into the nitty-gritty parts of the game a little easier to digest. And so that's sort of the method that I've also incorporated when it came to teaching students games and getting them to really go through the rules themselves. Because once they've played through it once, And there are some tactics and some things that, other players had used to try and get the win over them. They would want to go back and be like, okay, cool. Maybe there's something I missed because I lost. Why did I lose? Where did I go wrong? Oh, wait, we read this rule wrong. You can't do that. And then more than anything, before you know it, they're going through the entire rule book without realizing that by going through it, you're understanding the part of how this thing works. You're understanding why this person won over you winning and the tactics that came through that. And yeah, that's sort of my strategy through it. I don't know if Kirst has a different one.
I'm sure she does. But I'll come to you now. But it's very, we have a friend Simon, who always says, "Welcome to this game." That's the gambit. You sit down, and then he has, like you say, that kind of opening beat of explaining the fun of it and explaining those kinds of things. But what's nice also about that way of teaching is that the students do start to learn that a play experience, although it's dictated by mechanics and run through mechanics, is actually about something more than that. And it's about that moment of engagement with your friends. So yes, I'm rolling dice in King of Tokyo, and I'm doing this particular thing, but actually I'm a big monster and I'm destroying you and I'm destroying the set. Like, that's the truth of the game in terms of the kind of, we're in the play experience. They just have to get through the rules to get there. So for the students to think through in that way of like, yes, there's a dice and you have to do this, but actually there's a cool thing happening. It's really useful for the students to kind of engage and think in that way. Kirsten.
Firstly, I just want to clarify that Kieran is not knocking Rodney. We love Rodney. I just think that should be stated quite clearly. But otherwise, generally, I really agree with a lot of what with all of what Romeo is saying. I'll just add that we also make them do a lot of writing. So the students have a design journal and they have tasks each week. And if there is a rule book that you don't understand, write about it. If there is a rule that you think is not written clearly, write down how you would have written that rule. We really make the students do quite a lot of writing and hopefully thinking to go along with that writing in order to kind of think through that information and really kind of make their own attempt at trying to write it clearly. It's very fun for me when we hop onto the call on Monday at 8:00 and the students tell me that these rules were confusing, and then the rule set that they send me the next week makes no sense at all. And it's a difficult thing. Writing rules is really, really challenging, and it's easy when you're the reader to go, well, this isn't clear. But when you're the designer, when you're writing the rules, it's all in your head and you understand everything. And often I think rules get written in a way, particularly by our students, not necessarily so much in terms of the industry, by people who have the game in their head and so expect their players to just naturally understand. And so we really make the students work quite hard in their design journals every week, writing quite clearly, was this confusing? Why or why not? Explain, what was the word that tripped you up? Was it the order that the rules were laid out and that was confusing? And think through it in that way.
Great, thanks. Yeah, rules are always going to be a challenge. In some ways, I've seen my students struggle more with writing rules than with writing their kind of academic essays, right? There's a logic and a kind of thinking through and exposure to someone who you have to, as Kirsten says, assume knows nothing. They don't know how to play your game. Whereas when you're writing your academic essay, at least hey, my lecturer told me all this stuff 2 weeks ago anyway, so I'm just telling it back to them. They'll know what I'm talking about. So there's a kind of an easiness there. As we kind of progress into the last little bit of talking, there's something that I wanted to just touch on or ask you to, if you have any thoughts or comments on them, because it's one of the things that we base a lot of our teaching practice on. That's iteration and reflection, although we've touched on reflection here and there in terms of those kinds of things. But the thinking through iteration, and then sort of any other thoughts that I might have missed from our kind of agenda-y type thing. that you feel are quite important to touch on. But maybe we can start with iteration and then the reflective process, and including in that perhaps playtesting, which I know yesterday we also had quite a conversation on in the other education panel. But if either of you want to jump in there and kind of dig into it. Kirsten, I see. There you go. I was going to become a teacher.
To see who unmuted.
I was going to do a teacher and go, well, if no one wants to volunteer, I'm going to pick someone. And then I was just going to pick, but thanks. Go ahead.
No problem. I could see Romeo and I were making eye contact. Who's gonna do it? I think, iteration is in many ways fundamental to not only what we teach, but how we teach it. We have our course outline, which, is a spreadsheet. This is what we're doing each day of the week. These are the readings, the case studies, all of those kinds of things. And we tell the students in our very first interaction, this is what your course outline looks like today. Tomorrow it might look different. Next week it might look different. And that's not because we're unprepared. We're very prepared. We spend lots of time and effort thinking through the curriculum, but then things happen. Same way as they do when you have players playing your game, when you're playtesting. When users get involved, things get complicated and they break and they work out a lot differently than what you had expected. They make very different decisions. And so the way that we teach is very iterative in that every single Tuesday, the staff meet and we go, well, what's happening? What happened in tutorials? How was this reading received? Do we need to make a change here? This was supposed to be the case study. Is it as effective as it maybe could be? Would something else work better? And so we are constantly iterating. We're also iterating the structure of the overall course. So just in the last few weeks, changes have been made to the structure of our tutorials and what happens in them based on some of the kind of major I don't want to say problems, but areas where improvement is possible following their first big assignment. So we are constantly iterating, and in that way, trying as much as possible to demonstrate to the students that the need to iterate is not a bad thing. Getting new information and making adjustments because of that is vital to the game design process. That's what playtesting is. And so we're play testing our curriculum as we're teaching it, and we're making changes because of that. And hopefully the students take that kind of attitude of the importance of playtesting and iterating, and that the need to playtest and the need to iterate is not a sign of failure. It's not a mark of you having done a bad job in any way, shape, or form. It's just a natural part of the process.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt here for a bit to say that we're under 10 minutes, so I'm just going to go through a few of the questions that the chat has asked since then. First question is, how has the African context affected the way your students navigate a Western-influenced course?
That's a good one.
I think in every way. I think, for some of our students, and again, this is that kind of almost dichotomy of privileged versus kind of from a less privileged or an underprivileged background. Those who are privileged are coming to make games that are Western. And to get those kinds of students to think, whoa, why are you doing that? You have stories, you have narratives, you have imagery, you have so much that is unique to your continent, and you should be kind of following that. I think that's really important. And that's something we try to promote on the one side. On the other side, I know that a lot of the case studies have a white dude and you aren't seeing yourself reflected. And I know when you're making your Mass Effect character, you'll never get a fro as beautiful as Romeo's because of certain things. And it's about trying to empower to go, that's why you're studying here, so that you can go and do that, And I think we obviously try to find as many kind of curriculum examples that break that Western mold, that challenge that Western mold. It's really difficult. But I think that is what we're pushing towards. We're pushing towards the sense of being empowered, going, yeah, there's so much to gather from the rest of the world, but now let's make it our own. We're opposed to this idea of West, we mustn't teach West, we must only teach African. We must teach everything and then understand it from our own perspectives and understand it from our own way of being. When people talk about Pokemon Go and, there's varying degrees of safety in the world, but in South Africa, that game is basically, you can play it on campus, but it's actually not safe to be walking around the city. It's entirely not, and so how do we challenge the students, how do you make an augmented reality game that's appropriate to our context? And trying to do that. But it is a big challenge, choosing the curriculum, choosing the canon, and working through that. I don't know if the other two want to touch on it briefly, or we can take the next question.
I'll just say that one of the most interesting games I've ever encountered, and that includes my playing quite a good few hundred different board games that have been published, was a game that came from a group of first-year students a few years ago that was a worker placement game set within the context of an informal township. And if you don't know what that is, look it up. But there was something so interestingly South African and interesting in that way, which was great. But much more important was a deep understanding of that context, having come from that context, and as such, the mechanics and the theme worked together in a way that was far more interesting and far more effective than any of the zombie dungeon crawler games that also came out from the students, because the group that did something that they knew deeply and understood were able to introduce the kind of game design mechanic elements in a way that married the kind of form and the content together much better.
Okay, I'm going to go jump to the next question. That was really interesting, though. Related to lack of exposure to modern board gaming, how do students respond to analog gaming focus in the first year? Do some of them find it strange or simply want to get to the digital design part?
Yeah, Romeo, go for it. You take this one.
I'm going to talk a little bit from my experience and also from the students that I've seen. It's not, I wouldn't say it's unconventional for them, but having something as physical and as, I suppose, an analog as a board game is sort of a foreign concept. The fact that the calculations are done by themselves, the fact that there's a theme attached to this game, and how they work together. A lot of us have been exposed to checkers, chess, and murabaraba, and that's as far as sort of, and in some contexts, even Monopoly. But a lot of what we know, or a lot of what we know to be a strategic game or skillful or skill testing game is abstract. Is there no, is a piece is a piece is a piece, and a move is a move. While you have sort of this other variation where now it's no longer that the game is just the pieces on the board and it's about the strategy that you make, but it's now about how they collate, how they come together, and how they come together in terms of a theme, how the theme starts to play through the mechanics. And so that sort of distance between the two is not a hard concept to grasp, but is one that requires some working around. Because we'll think, oh, a theme, love and idleness, cool, and now make a game about love and idleness, and trying to find the combination between this love and idleness and what mechanics I can put towards it. Sorry, that was the first thing that came to my mind for some reason. And putting those two together, there can be a little bit of friction there. On the inverse, though, there's also a great reception to board games, because it's no longer a thing that is distant from me. It's no longer a thing that I need lots of money to put into for me to have the experience of. And I think that having it that free, I suppose, and sort of so in front of you makes it less of a mystical idea and a mystical artifact. But I'm sure Kieran had something else he wanted to add there. Have you lost Kieran?
Seems as if we may have lost.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't you folks tell us where we can find you online and in different locations in the real world?
Kirsten?
Sure. So, you can find me on Twitter, just at my name, at Kirsten Dupree, and I'm just double checking Kieran's. His is at KJ Reid, REIDSA. I will also send you over to YouTube, where if you look for Wits Digital Arts, you'll find our page and you can find the video of our exhibition last year. So if you're interested in any of the work that our students are doing, please go have a look. There's some really interesting stuff there, lots of interesting cartoons and all sorts. So you can look there. Seems like Kieran is back though.
Yeah, sorry, it cut out. Are we just wrapping up?
I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Okay.
Um,
But yeah, go ahead, Romeo.
I was just gonna say I'm not active on Twitter, but it's at Disaster Unicorn, and that's pretty much my alias for everything. On Discord at Disaster Unicorn, except Facebook, Romeo Molongoana. Yeah, but otherwise PlayStation at Disaster Unicorn, everything at Disaster Unicorn.
That's really great. Thanks, Romeo. Thanks, everyone. I missed what was happening. So, Kirsten, do you want to just close us out? Because I'm not sure where we're at.
Sure. So thank you all so much for those of you who are here. We can't see you, we don't know who you are, but thank you so much for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I know we've got lots of things that we're excited about. Kieran is speaking later today in 2 panels about dramaturgy and TTRPGs and playful academia, and Romeo is speaking in a panel about play and vulnerability. So check those out later and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.